The brass survey cap was stamped in the summer of 1938. Its coordinates entered the Federal Control Network the same year. Since then, every surrounding survey has treated the number as fixed. The instrument that set it was a theodolite. Its serial number appears in a departure memorandum. The location was a bench above a glacial basin in the Wind River Range, Wyoming. But the cap has never been reoccupied, not once, not by any recorded expedition. The party reported clear weather, clean observations, a complete station. The network still depends on the point. The point has never been verified. The Wind River Range runs roughly southeast to northwest across Fremont and Sublette counties in west-central Wyoming. At its widest point, the range spans nearly 40 miles. At its highest, Gannett Peak reaches 13,804 feet, the tallest summit in the state. Most of the range sits within the Bridger Wilderness, a designation that limits motorized access almost entirely. The wilderness boundary was drawn to preserve existing conditions, which meant preserving, among other things, the absence of maintained roads. Getting in requires planning, serious planning. The primary trailheads at Big Sandy, Elkhart Park, and Green River Lakes sit at elevations between 8,000 and 8,500 feet. From those points, usable trails extend between 12 and 30 miles before reaching the interior. Beyond those trails, travel is cross-country, over loose moraine, through boulder fields, and across snowfields that persist well into July most years. Winters close the range entirely to practical access from roughly late October through early June. The snowpack in the Central Highlands often exceeds 15 feet. Spring melt is unpredictable, and high elevation basins can hold standing ice through the first week of August in heavy accumulation years. Summer weather is not reliable. Afternoon thunderstorms develop quickly along the high ridgelines, sometimes without the cloud buildup patterns that experienced backcountry travelers watch for. Lightning events above treeline are common. Temperatures at elevation can drop below freezing on any night of the calendar year. The drainage systems running off the central spine are numerous and complicated. The Green River originates near the northern interior. The New Fork, the Popo Ague, and several smaller tributaries extend east and south. Most of these waterways are unbridged in the wilderness interior. Crossing them in early season, when snowmelt volume is highest, presents a genuine logistical problem for anyone moving. Equipment. Topographic mapping of the range's interior developed slowly. Early survey parties in the late 19th century documented the outer drainages and primary passes with reasonable accuracy. The high basins, those sitting above 10,500 feet and surrounded by subsidiary ridgelines, remained incompletely described well into the mid-20th century. Not because they were unknown, but because the geometry of the terrain made triangulation difficult. Access was seasonal, and the administrative priority of remote mountain interiors was simply lower than the valleys and corridors below. By the 1930s, federal mapping programs had identified several benchmark locations within the Central Range that lacked verified control data. These were stations in name only, coordinates assigned from secondary inference, elevations approximated, horizontal positions unconfirmed by direct occupation. One such station occupied a bench above a glacially carved basin in the northern interior, approximately 7 miles east, northeast of a named pass and well above the elevation where any established trail system reached. Establishing a verified control point, there would require a full expedition, not a day trip, not a weekend survey. A multi-week operation with equipment transport, base camp construction, and enough personnel to run meaningful observations over a sufficient number of clear nights. That kind of commitment was unusual for a single station, but the station's location placed it in a gap between two established triangulation networks. Without it, a significant block of interior terrain would remain geometrically unconnected to the broader federal control system. The assignment was eventually made. A field memorandum dated June of 1938 documents the departure of a 6-person survey party from the Green River Lakes trailhead. The party carried theodolites, a chronometer, steel taping equipment, and provisions for 22 days. The assigned lead surveyor, referred to in subsequent record by last name only, Halverson, had completed similar expeditions in the Absaroka Range and in portions of the Idaho border highlands. His field reports from those assignments were described in internal review as thorough and methodical. The memorandum notes expected arrival at the target basin within 4 to 5 days of departure, depending on snow conditions at the upper crossing. A second document, also from June 1938, is a supply manifest. It lists equipment serial numbers, food weights, and a note, appended by hand, that weather windows in the range that summer had been favorable through the first 2 weeks of the month. Neither document contains anything procedurally unusual. The first field entry in the recovered documentation is dated the 7th day after departure. Halverson notes that the party reached the bench site on schedule. Conditions at elevation were described as clear, with light, variable winds. The ground surface near the intended station point was firm enough for stable instrument placement. 2 large cairns already present at the site were noted and measured for positional reference. Setup of the primary instrument occupied the better part of 2 days. Backside observations to previously established stations to the south and east were completed on the second evening after arrival. The reads were clean. A brief notation records that one team member identified a secondary prominence to the northwest that had not appeared on the sketch maps provided at briefing. Halverson noted its approximate bearing and estimated elevation. He did not assign it significance. Over the following days, the party completed angle sets, ran vertical observations, and began the process of computing preliminary closures. The numbers were consistent. Halverson's notes indicate satisfaction with the data quality, a word he uses sparingly in comparison to his other archived reports. By the 14th day at the site, the station had been fully established. The benchmark was set in concrete, witness posts were placed, a brass cap was stamped with the station designation and the year. The final entry from that period records the camp being broken down. Equipment was packed. The party prepared to retrace its route back toward the trailhead. Halverson's last notation from the site is a weather observation. Winds increasing from the northwest, cloud development above the western ridge. He estimated the party would reach the lower drainage crossing within 2 days if movement began by early morning. The entry ends there. No distress is recorded. No personnel are unaccounted for. The return is referenced in an administrative summary from late August 1938, confirming that the party exited the field and the data package was submitted for reduction. The station was logged as complete. It was assigned a designation in the federal network. Its coordinates were recorded. Its data was incorporated into the broader triangulation adjustment for the region. Standard procedure at that time called for reoccupation of new primary stations within 3 to 5 years of initial establishment to verify stability, check for any displacement, and run a second round of observations to confirm the original data. No reoccupation order for this station appears in the records, not in 1941, not in 1943. Not in any of the post-war years when survey programs across Wyoming expanded substantially. Later triangulation documentation for the surrounding region references the station's computed position as a held value, meaning subsequent surveys accepted its coordinates without independent verification and built outward from them. The station itself was never revisited, at least not by any party whose records have been retained. What the administrative record does not explain is why the gap persisted. Survey programs in Wyoming expanded considerably through the 1940s and into the 1950s. Federal mapping priorities shifted after the war, and the Coast and Geodetic Survey, along with cooperating state agencies, moved substantial resources into areas that had previously gone undocumented. New stations were established. Old ones were verified. The triangulation network across the western half of the state was tightened at multiple points during this period. The bench station above the northern basin was not among them. A 1952 program summary for Fremont County lists 14 stations scheduled for reoccupation or verification during that field season. The bench station does not appear on the list. It does not appear on the 1957 list either. By the time the next comprehensive network review was conducted for this portion of Wyoming, the station's coordinates had already been absorbed as fixed values into 2 subsequent triangulation adjustments. Questioning them at that point would have meant reopening computations that had been closed and accepted for nearly 2 decades. That kind of administrative reversal rarely happens without a specific trigger, an observed discrepancy, a formal request, or a documented reason to doubt the original data. None of those appear in the file. A second documentation cluster surfaces from the late summer of 1951. A two-person reconnaissance party, operating under a different program and with a different institutional affiliation, was tasked with identifying potential locations for a new secondary station in the northern interior of the range. Their assignment was not connected to the 1938 expedition. The brief they were given did not reference Halverson's work by name, though the bench station's designation appears once in their preparatory materials, listed among existing control points they could use for orientation. Their field notes from August 14th describe reaching the upper basin after a 2-day approach from a different trailhead to the east. The notes are sparse, functional. The lead observer, identified only by initials RM, records the weather as partly cloudy with stable conditions, the approach route as manageable, the basin floor as wet from recent snowmelt. On August 15th, RM records a notation about the bench above the basin. The party had not been assigned to visit the existing station, but the bench was visible from their position and within a reasonable detour distance. The entry reads, "Bench observed from lower basin, approximately 400 feet above. No approach attempted. Party continued on primary assignment. No reason is given for not approaching. The bench was within reach. The weather was stable. The party had time." Their field notes from the following 3 days show a deliberate pace, with rest periods recorded and no urgency apparent in the language. RM does not explain the decision. The entry simply moves forward, as if the bench had already been accounted for and set aside. The reconnaissance party completed their assignment. Their recommended station location was approved. A new secondary point was established approximately 4 miles southeast of the bench. Their final report references the bench station's designation one more time, as a held value used to verify their own computed position. They did not flag any concern with it. They did not recommend verification. The file closes there. Several practical explanations account for most of what the record shows, and each deserves consideration on its own terms before the gaps are treated as meaningful. Federal survey programs operated under significant resource constraints throughout the late 1930s and into the post-war decade. Budgets fluctuated, personnel rotated frequently, expedition planning required months of logistical coordination, and the difficulty of reaching the bench station. The same difficulty that made initial occupation unusual would have pushed it down any prioritization list when competing against more accessible stations with similar or greater network value. The fact that the bench station's coordinates were absorbed as a held value is not inherently suspicious. That practice was common. When a station produced clean data on first occupation and showed no internal inconsistencies, reoccupation was deferred in favor of stations with less reliable first runs. Halverson's notes describe data quality as satisfying. From an administrative standpoint, that assessment reduced urgency. Documentation gaps from this era are also well documented in their own right. Transfer of records between agencies, wartime disruptions to institutional continuity, and the simple attrition of paper files over decades mean that absence of a record is not the same as absence of an event. A reoccupation order may have been issued and lost. A follow-up expedition may have been planned and canceled without producing paperwork that survived. As for RM's decision not to approach the bench in 1951, the most ordinary reading is the most likely one. The party had a specific assignment. Detouring to an existing station outside their scope would have required informal justification that most field observers simply did not generate. You stayed on task. That was the professional norm. Taken together, these factors explain a great deal. Bureaucratic momentum, resource allocation, data acceptance protocols, and the practical logic of fieldwork in difficult terrain. Each one applies here without contradiction. What does not resolve cleanly is the cairn notation. Halverson's field entry from the first day at the bench records 2 large cairns already present at the site. He measured them for positional reference and moved on. The notation is brief, clinical, exactly the kind of procedural observation a methodical surveyor would make. But the bench sat above 11,000 feet, approximately 7 miles from the nearest trail, in terrain that required a multi-day approach with loaded equipment. The 1938 party was, according to the pre-expedition documentation, the first team assigned to occupy that specific point. Cairns of the size described do not accumulate accidentally. They are built deliberately, usually to mark a location that someone intended to return to, or to guide others toward a specific point. Who built them and when is not addressed anywhere in the record. Halvorsen did not speculate. The administrative files contain no prior reference to the bench as a visited location. No earlier expedition documentation for that portion of the range mentions the site. The cairns are simply there, in the notes, unremarked upon after their initial measurement. It is possible they were remnants of an informal visit, a hunting party, a private surveyor operating outside federal programs, a backcountry traveler who left markers for personal navigation. None of those possibilities contradict anything in the record, but none of them are confirmed either, and the documentation that would most likely contain a reference to prior activity at that elevation, the preparatory research Halvorsen's team would have conducted before departure, has not been located. The cairns predate the 1938 expedition. Beyond that, the record offers nothing. The brass cap set by Halvorsen's party in the summer of 1938 is, in principle, still there. Benchmark monuments of that type were constructed to last. Concrete set, stamped, positioned with witness posts to allow relocation. Absent deliberate removal or severe geological disturbance, a cap installed at that elevation and in that substrate could persist for well over a century. Whether the station has been physically visited since R.M. observed the bench from the basin floor in 1951 is not documented. No formal reoccupation appears in any subsequent network file. No informal account of the site surfaces in the available archive. The station exists in the federal record as a fixed point, a number held in place by the acceptance of those who came after, none of whom went back to confirm what the number rested on. The data was submitted, reduced, and filed. The expedition was logged as complete, but the archive remains open. If this kind of documentation interests you, there is more where this came from.